Hello, and thank you for watching this presentation. My name is Vasiliki Papathanassiou, and I am presenting this work together with Ekaterini Zafiri from Atoglu Junior High School in Greece. Our presentation is titled Level Up Pyramid, or else LUP, L-U-P, a gamified framework for values-based on motivation and citizenship education. Although the title uses the language of gamification, our current conceptualization is more precise. We understand LUP not as a reward-based system, but as a preventive, developmental participation architecture. In this presentation, I will explain the problem that led to this framework, its theoretical foundations, the way it was implemented, and the main interim findings that emerged. Across many educational systems today, a structural paradox has become increasingly visible. Academic demands continue to intensify, yet student motivation, relational belonging, and civic participation often weaken. At the same time, school discipline remains largely reactive. Teachers are frequently expected to manage disruption after it appears, rather than cultivate preventive classroom cultures that reduce the need for intervention in the first place. A second difficulty is fragmentation. Motivation, behavior regulations, and citizenship education are often treated as separate domains. Students are asked to succeed academically, behave appropriately, and develop democratic values. But these dimensions are not always structurally integrated in everyday classroom life. This is the pedagogical gap that the Level Up Pyramid seeks to address. The central proposition of LUP is that participation should not be treated as a secondary outcome of good teaching. Instead, participation should be understood as the structural mechanism through which motivation, classroom climate, and civic agency become connected. In this sense, LUP is not primarily a classroom management technique, and it's not a traditional reward system. It is a developmental participation architecture. Its purpose is to organize classroom life through expanding forms of responsibility so that agency develops from the personal level to the relational, collective, and civic levels. This is why the framework is both preventive and developmental. It aims to shape the culture of classroom life before problems intensify, while also supporting long-term growth in responsibility and participation. Because the framework uses the metaphor, the Level Up Pyramid is organized around four interconnected domains of agency. The first is self-agency. This refers to personal responsibility, reflective ownership, and the ability to regulate one's own participation and learning. The second is relational agency. At this level, participation becomes dialogic and interpersonal. Students learn to listen, cooperate, negotiate, and become accountable within relationships. The third is collective agency. Here, responsibility expands toward the classroom as a micro-community. Students coordinate, share roles, and contribute to the functioning of the group as a whole. The fourth is civic agency. This refers to the outward articulation of responsibility beyond the immediate classroom context through public communication, institutional participation, and broader social engagement. these levels are not rigid stages. They are overlapping in developmental domains through which responsibility gradually expands. The figure illustrates the developmental structure of the level-up pyramid. At the base, self-agency provides the foundation through personal responsibility and reflective ownership. From there, participation expands into relational agency, where responsibility is enacted through dialogue and mutual accountability. The next level is collective agency, where students take part in coordinated classroom participation and shared epistemic responsibility. At the top, civil agency represents the outward extension of responsibility into broader public and institutional contexts. What matters here is not hierarchy in the competitive sense, but widening circles of participation and responsibility. The pyramid is developmental, not punitive, and it reflects the expansion of agency across increasingly social and civic domains. The framework draws on several complementary theoretical traditions. First, self-determination theory helps explain why autonomy, competence, and relatedness are essential for sustainable motivation and internalized engagement. Second, classroom climate research highlights the importance of belonging, fairness, trust, and relational safety in supporting both learning and stability. Third, democratic educational thought, especially the work of Dewey, Biesta, and Westheimer and Kahne, frames participation as a lived practice of citizenship rather than the passive learning of civic content. And fourth, preventive and relational pedagogies support the idea that discipline is strongest when it is embedded in the participatory culture of the classroom rather than imposed only through reaction and control. Lab synthesizes these perspectives into one developmental design logic. The aim of the study was to examine the level-up pyramid as an agency-based preventive participation architecture and to explore the patterns associated with its implementation in a lower secondary school context. More specifically, the study asked three questions. First, how do quantitative and qualitative findings describe developmental shifts in classroom participation, relational climate, and emerging form of agency? Second, which descriptive indicators suggest changes in classroom cohesion and participatory stability over time? And third, which structural features of the framework appear to support its potential adaptability beyond the immediate implementation context? This study is exploratory and theory building in nature. Its purpose is not to establish causal effects, but to examine whether the framework shows coherence and promise under real school conditions. The study took place in a small private school secondary in Greece. The full student cohort included 27 students across 3 grade levels, ranging in age from 12 to 15. Implementation began in October 2025 as an ongoing developmental process integrated into everyday school life rather than introduced as a short-term intervention. The present presentation reports interim findings through February 2026. Methodologically, the study followed an embedded explanatory case study design. It combined quantitative and qualitative sources in order to capture both observable participation patterns and lived classroom experience. The goal was not statistical generalization, but analytic triangulation and theory-building interpretation. Data were collected from multiple complementary sources. These included theory-informed student questionnaires administered at 3 time points, teacher-rated descriptive indicators, incident monitoring notes derived from school records, whole cohort-focused discussions, optional student interviews, and teacher-reflective logs. The questionnaire items were aligned with the developmental dimensions of the framework, including self-agency, relational agency, collective participation, and civic orientation. Teacher ratings were interpreted as descriptive directional indicators rather than standardized measures. Qualitative sources helped contextualize the quantitative tendencies and provided a richer understanding of how participation was experienced within the school environment. In practice, the framework was enacted through recurring participatory mechanisms embedded in everyday school life. These mechanisms included rotating responsibility roles, shared classroom routines, symbolic recognition, collective reflection, and structured opportunities for student voice and decision-making. The purpose was to normalize participation as an expected condition of classroom culture. Instead of asking whether students would participate, the structure assumed that participation was part of how the classroom functioned. In this way, regulation could gradually shift from teacher-managed control towards shared responsibility and participatory stability. The interim findings suggested several directional trends. Participation in classroom activities increased across the implementation period, moving from lower initial levels toward more consistent and self-initiated engagement. Indicators of responsibility also increased, suggesting a gradual willingness among students to assume roles and contribute beyond minimum expectations. Classroom cohesion and relational climate showed particularly notable improvements over time. At the same time, teacher interventions related to conflict appeared to decrease. These trends do not constitute inferential statistical evidence. They are descriptive indicators intended to support analytic interpretation. However, taken together, they suggest increasing participatory stability within the school context. The qualitative findings converge with the descriptive trends. Students increasingly describe participation as shared responsibility rather than as teacher-driven obligation. Teachers reported stronger initiative, more dialogue among students, and a reduced need for direct intervention. A recurring pattern was the transition from initial uncertainty to participatory confidence. Another was the gradual ownership of classroom roles and routines. Participation also appeared to expand beyond purely academic requirements, suggesting early civic-oriented tendencies. The convergence across data sources supports a key interpretive idea. Participation may function not simply as a behavior to be observed, but as a developmental structure that reorganizes classroom culture. The principal theoretical contribution of this study is the reframing of agency as a structural property of classroom culture. In other words, agency may not be only an individual characteristic that students either possess or do not possess. It may also emerge through the participatory architecture of everyday classroom life. Rather than treating motivation, classroom regulation, and citizenship education as separate domains, the Level Up Pyramid proposes a developmental design through which these dimensions become structurally aligned. The findings are exploratory and context-bound, but they suggest that when participation is intentionally designed into classroom culture, schools may move from reactive discipline toward preventive regulation, from isolated student compliance towards shared responsibility, and from abstract civic instruction towards lived democratic participation. At the same time, we are currently seeking to expand this work through collaborations with other schools in order to explore broader implementation and generate more systematically measurable outcomes across diverse educational contexts. Thank you very much for your attention. We will be very glad to continue the discussion and hear how these ideas resonate within your own educational context.